Turkish ground forces on Wednesday crossed the border into Syria, while Turkish jets and artillery began pounding YPG positions. The operation, dubbed vaguely as Peace Spring, was a long time in the making, but it commenced only after President Trump abruptly announced the exit of American forces in the region, which gave his Turkish counterpart the green light to strike at YPG forces, all adding to the intensification of the Syrian battlespace. I'm your host Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. Today's video is sponsored by NordVPN, which allows you to surf the web anonymously while your location stays private and your user data is encrypted at an affordable price. NordVPN also has Android and Apple apps for your phone, which are free with your account. So if this sounds good to you, head on over to nordvpn.com/CaspianReport. You'll get a 70% discount on the 3-year plan, and if you use the promo code CaspianReport, you'll get an additional month free. In the fog of the Syrian civil war, the Pentagon allied with the Syrian Kurdish militias to fight ISIS and the al-Assad government. The Kurdish militias, however, weren't the Pentagon's first choice. Initially, the Americans had sought to train moderate Islamist and secular Arabs to take up arms against al-Assad. The program cost hundreds of millions of dollars, but only produced a few dozen fighters. It was a complete disaster. So Washington changed tactics and looked to the largest non-Arab demographic group in Syria, the Kurds. The largest and most capable of the Syrian Kurdish militias was the People's Protection Units, better known by its acronym, the YPG. The trouble, however, was that the YPG had close ties to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, which is classified by NATO, including the United States, as a terrorist organization that has waged an armed conflict against the Turkish state since the late 1980s. For the Pentagon, an alliance with the YPG was going to be challenging to sell.
They formally called themselves the YPG, who the Turks would say equated to the PKK. You're dealing with a terrorist enemy of mine. How can you do that, ally? So we literally played back to them that, hey, you got to change your brand. What do you want to call yourself besides the YPG? And with about a day's notice, they declared that they were the Syrian Democratic Forces. I thought it was a stroke of brilliance to put democracy in there somewhere.
The reinvention of the YPG into the Syrian Democratic Forces was a stroke of brilliance in terms of PR. Media outlets in Europe and North America embraced the romanticized image of Kurdish fighters. Turkey, however, was having none of it, but there wasn't much the Turks could do. For convenience, we will refer to the SDF as the YPG. Since 2014, the YPG, with American backing, began driving ISIS back from northeastern Syria and simultaneously conquered those predominantly Arab territories. But by allying with both Turkey and the YPG, the United States has acted as a buffer space between the two. Turkey believes that the YPG, with the assistance of the PKK, will eventually use northeastern Syria as a platform to launch attacks into Turkey. Moreover, Syrian Kurds are closely related to Turkish Kurds, more so than Iraqi Kurds. As such, policymakers in Ankara feared that an independent Syrian Kurdish state would encourage its own Kurdish population to seek independence as well, who account for roughly 15% of Turkey's population. Turkish policymakers therefore have long sought to push into YPG-controlled territories, so much so that Ankara has prioritized its objective to neutralize the YPG above all others, even over the removal of al-Assad. The only reason the Turkish military had not moved in before this week was because of the ongoing negotiations. More specifically, Turkey wanted a 32-kilometer deep buffer zone across the length of the Turkish-Syrian border east of the Euphrates River. This would have provided for a significant buffer between the Turkish state and the YPG, and it would have allowed Erdogan to resettle some Syrian refugees in the area. The YPG rejected the proposal and suggested a 5-kilometer deep buffer in non-populated regions across the border. As negotiations reached an impasse, it became all too obvious that the substantial discrepancies between the YPG and Turkey were too wide to overcome by diplomatic means. Ankara's patience began to run out, and in early August its military geared up tens of thousands of combat-ready troops by the border for a unilateral push into northeastern Syria regardless of US objections. With the breakdown of the negotiations, Washington was faced with a problematic choice. It could either be allied with the small but loyal YPG or the Republic of Turkey, a powerhouse that holds an indispensable geographic position. From a geopolitical angle, the choice was simple. Turkey's strategic value was more significant than that of the YPG. Plus, since Trump has declared the defeat of ISIS, he no longer believes a security arrangement with the YPG is necessary. So, on October the 6th, after a phone call between Trump and Erdogan, the White House agreed to withdraw US forces from Syria. Erdogan had the green light, and the Turkish military machine crossed the Syrian border. In truth, the YPG was always in a vulnerable position. The occupied terrain is flat and lacks natural defenses. It's a space of land that is shared by Arab and Kurdish tribes, but has been conquered by foreign powers many times throughout history. The indefensible terrain is what enabled ISIS to conquer the land rapidly and then later to lose it just as quickly. Thus, as motivated as the Syrian Kurdish rebels are, their best bet is to make Turkey's inevitable conquest as slow and costly as possible, while Kurdish-affiliated political parties and institutions attempt to shore up external assistance. From Turkish point of view, the opposite is true. They will want to move their military campaign as fast as they can for as long as they can before international backlash builds up a case. Speed is the name of the game. Yet, beyond the respective interests of both belligerents, the clash between the YPG and Turkey holds numerous unintended consequences that will contribute to the intensification of the Syrian conflict. Foremost, as fighting drags on, the YPG contingents are likely to mobilize their numbers to the forefront, leaving the makeshift prisons holding ISIS fighters insufficiently guarded. This will allow for the extremist factions to exploit the chaos and regroup. The White House claims that Turkey will take control of the prisoners, but many of the detention facilities are deep in Syrian territory, beyond the operational scale of the first stage of the Turkish operation. Although the regrouping jihadists are unlikely to regain significant power or land, the escape of jihadist fighters remains a security hazard that will have repercussions across Syria. Secondly, the Turkish-Russian ceasefire in Idlib is in a fragile state. With the Turks distracted in the northeast, the Russians could decide to break the truce and aid al-Assad in his recapture of the Idlib stronghold to the northwest. As fighting intensifies across northern Syria, a new wave of refugees will take shape. According to the British-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, already more than 100,000 people have been displaced as a result of the Turkish operation. This number is likely to inflate in the coming months. The third unintended consequence of the US exit concerns the value of an American handshake. Although Trump makes a valid point that the United States should have left the affairs in the hands of the locals, abandoning the YPG now will hurt American credibility. Going into the future, the United States will find it more difficult to persuade other groups to risk strategic alignment with Washington. By leaving the YPG high and dry, Trump's decision will strengthen the widespread belief in the Middle East that the United States is not a reliable ally. In the long term, such damaging credibility could hurt American efforts in other parts of the world. The final consequence involves the Turkish economy. Since 2018, Turkey has suffered from high inflation, a tanking currency, and rising levels of dollar-denominated debt. After plumbing the debts last year, the economy has somewhat stabilized, but Erdogan's decision to invade Syria has drawn fierce backlash from both Democratic and Republican lawmakers in Washington who have vowed to punish Turkey with sanctions. The shock of the sanctions could hurt the weak Turkish lira, and the likelihood of sanctions from Congress is high. A bipartisan draft bill seeks to apply sanctions on arms sales and military assistance to Turkey, as well as punish individuals. If the bill were to pass, Trump would have to sign a waiver to Congress every 90 days to delay the enforcement of the sanctions. This would set up a sharp divide between the executive branch and Congress. In the end, Trump, Erdogan, as well as the YPG leadership act according to the fact that nations have no permanent friends or allies. They only have permanent interests. I've been your host Shirvan from CaspianReport. Credit goes to our Patreon community for voting on this topic and giving us the means to produce content like this. To learn more, visit the link in the description. Thank you for your time and Sağ ol.